What I witnessed in these places, what I witnessed in the prisons, was that there's like this beautiful crystalline quality of the human heart that is sometimes found most purely in the margins, where you have people who have lost everything, who a community has outcast, who has said, you are nothing, we don't know how to interface with you because you don't fit into the mythology or the paradigm that we have been conditioned to see as normal or okay or acceptable. Or maybe we've been conditioned with a story that says, be afraid of you. And then to go there and then like tap into my own humanity, tap into where I've held my own judgments or fears, and then to recognize like just the subtle shifts in my life that determined whether I ended up there or whether I ended up on this path that I got into college on scholarship, and and what I saw there was, it was something subtle. It was like community. It was having a safety net of people that cared enough to make sure that I didn't fall through the cracks.
That if art is a form of therapy, therapy is also very much an art form. You kind of just have to see what comes up and then to be ready to trust.
You're handed the materials, the paint, the brushes, the clay, the wood, whatever it might be, and that's the technique. Or, you can be taught techniques, materials and techniques, but you're right, the art form, that truly is what comes through. You can have 10 people in a classroom, you can teach them the same lesson, you can hand them the same type of paintbrushes, same color paint, and you'll get entirely different images on that canvas, even if you're telling them to paint the same subject. So with the couples I work with, those moments where they're not talking, those actually become really foundational pillars of trust that actually open up the relational field for them to come in and do the deeper work, for them to talk about their vulnerabilities, their fears.
Sometimes not talking about things is a brilliant way to resolve conflict. And I know you're right, it is a paradox. This is why all of like happiness and mental health are paradoxes or contradictions or think good ideas that are in conflict with one another. Like, because you don't want to bury things, but you also, like in Northern Ireland, basically the way that they figured out how to stop killing each other was they just quit talking about whether they were British or Irish. Lauren, thank you for joining me.
You're so welcome. Thanks for having me.
So I'm always fascinated to meet people like you who don't fit neatly into any one box. And I'm wondering, when people ask you the question, what do you do? What do you tell them?
That is a really good question, because I think there's multiple layers to that. I mean, I call it my front of the house work is as a therapist. So I've had a private practice as a licensed therapist for 10 years, and it's been the arc of my work has been in the mental health field and clinical background, for the past 18 years. I'm also an artist and a musician, and so creativity and music are also a big role in what I do. And then, deeper than that has been just like this arc of being with the human psyche and human consciousness through the lenses of myth and storytelling, whether that be through movement or writing, or experiencing different cultures and the lenses there. I hold space for ritual and ceremony, because I think those are things that really set apart the human experience. Is the way that throughout history we have created ritual to mark different passages of time and thresholds in our lives, and it's a really beautiful creative practice. So there's a very roundabout answer for what I do. I
love that. Right.
Yeah.
It's really more of a question of like what you are, who you are, right? And people are so multiple. And it's kind of one of the things I've learned is quite delightful about people once you understand what's going on. That all of us have a bunch of little parts inside of us. But as I was listening to your answer, I was thinking, knowing you as I do, all of those kind of seem like one thing.
Right.
They're different ways of describing the same thing.
They're raised from the same source.
Yeah, right. I love that. That's beautiful. Raised from the same source. As a therapist, you mentioned a few things. Are you an art therapist or a music therapist or a XYZ therapist or just a therapist? Or?
So to use the language, it's LPC, licensed professional counselor. That's the license I have. The degree is a master's in the art of counseling. And so it is a clinical degree, and it's a clinical practice. So I work with trauma. I work with anything that falls under that lens. And so like in the years that I've worked, in this way, I've also experienced different modalities, received a lot of training and techniques that deal with trauma, whether that be EMDR, there's IFS, which is called our internal family systems. There's many different systems and techniques. And then I've kind of developed my own modalities from that and my own approach. And that's what the beauty of this career actually is, and what is so missing from so much of the clinical training is like how to then create it to be your own expression. I see this happen all the time with some people that I offer consultation to is, they get in the field and they stick to these techniques, but they don't ever let it like themselves. They don't like, what do we do? How do we let ourselves move through this work and become something that is mine or a true expression of mine, and so,
Could you give me an example of that, like maybe from your own experience or a consultation where it's just like, I can imagine myself going to a seminar and learning about something and then being like, I feel this way a lot about like spiritual practices. It's like, I'm a white guy. It feels like that's not for me, And so there's like some resistance of how do I implement that? Do you have an example of how that's come up in your work or the consultation?
Yeah, sure. I mean, for example, like as a trauma therapist, we're trained in these evidence-based practices, and that's great. And also as someone, like I've always been someone who works at the edge, always been at like what is the next wave coming? And so being unafraid to kind of like push against that edge. Like for example, I'll work with, someone and they'll be consulting with me like, why isn't my client having a breakthrough? Why isn't my client having a breakthrough? I've been doing all these techniques. I'm doing EMDR. I'm doing brain spotting. I'm doing all of this. And in the consultation, what's happening is they're actually stunting the expression of themselves in the relational field with the client. And so what's happening is like, yes, they're employing all the right techniques, but the art of presence of like, can they bring themselves to the experience, and can that person feel the safety of that person being in presence with them? And so that art of presence is something that that's our own internal work to do as human beings and just as people in this field. And so that's where I usually gently push the people that I do consultation with in that direction of like, what is your practice of presence? How your technique accounts for maybe 5% of like what you do, and it matters about that much. It's great to have. They're great tools. But the most telling factor of, a client having a breakthrough or an outcome is like presence. Can you be there with them? Can their breath find your breath? Can their heart rate find your heart rate? Can you be there with them in that place to even allow for the entry point of those techniques to come in? So, I mean, that's an example. I mean, that's probably something that happens a lot. It's not just one example. It's many times that's happened. Or, in my personal practice, because I do movement and dance as well, and somatic work. So somatic just means body-centered. And, for client, like therapy, we traditionally think of it as like, I'm sitting here, you're sitting on the couch or whatever, and we're talking and we're analyzing and we're gathering data. And that is a helpful part that like builds the bridge, but it doesn't actually walk the person across the bridge. And so we use the words and that verbal conversational data to build a bridge between where they're at now and where they want to be. But the movement and the breathing is actually what gets them across the bridge. So, that's something that I've learned that you can't really train a modality for that. That's an intuitive skill that is developed over time of working in this field. It's like, oh, it is time for them to move. Like, we've done enough talking. Let me get them up out of the seat. And let me have them like move their arms open. What happens when they expose their chest? What happens when they get out of a hunched position? And that's an edge I've started to work a lot too. And that's something that you can't train for that. You can be trained on how to create a safe container so that you don't overstep and create more harm. But it's a deeper intuitive practice in that way. And takes a lot of self-trust.
It must. I was just struck by, first off, what you just said was really beautiful to me in its own right. But I've also been struck by how intuitive therapy is, like especially when you're dealing with things like trauma or things that are almost have a mythological significance in a person's life. Yeah. How much creativity and instinct come into play. I've had this idea, just a turn of phrase that came to me about a year or two ago when I was thinking about a friend who was my first guest on this podcast, who's also a therapist and a shamanic healer. that if art is a form of therapy, therapy is also very much an art form. Like
Yes.
it's very much, you kind of just have to see what comes up and then to be ready to trust.
You're handed the materials, the paint, the brushes, the clay, the wood, whatever it might be, and that's the technique. Or, you know, you can be taught techniques, materials and techniques, but you write the art form. That truly is what comes through. You can have 10 people in a classroom, you can teach them the same lesson, you can hand them the same type of paint brushes, same color paint, and you'll get entirely different, you know, images on that canvas, even if you're telling them to paint the same subject. And that really, that's a skill that's innate.
Yeah, that's why when I asked earlier, like, are you an art therapist or a music therapist or whatever, that's like, that's almost redundant.
I'm an artist that's a therapist.
There you go. Yeah, yeah, and makes therapy an art form too.
Yeah.
You mentioned it's this sense of presence. One thing that I was thinking about when you were talking about that, I have just a felt sense of what you're referring to. Like I've been on both sides of that dynamic of feeling safe in my body and mostly not feeling safe in my body. So it's like, okay, I think I know what that's like.
Yeah.
I was also thinking about one of the things that has been a focus on this podcast has been this kind of tension between Western and Eastern thought.
Yes.
Or Western, or really more like older and newer forms of thought. And so like we definitely have, you know, all the clinical, you know, education and training that you have that's very Western and very part of the Western tradition of psychology and rationalism and materialistic reductivism. And then we have these Eastern but also American and indigenous ways of thinking. And there's all these tensions between those things that I find in your profession a lot. And you seem to navigate that tension very, very beautifully and very fluidly. And I was wondering if in this moment, like if you're talking to a therapist on a consultation about presence, my first thought to come to mind was that doesn't sound very Rogerian. Like it doesn't sound like something they would teach you. And as to be a therapist is, I would think they would tell you to put up the wall.
In the kind of the traditional older models of psychology and psychotherapy, yes, that was kind of the idea of like be like this neutral front, and then, you know, your client is just kind of experiencing themselves. And, you know, that was a part of the arc of this field developing. I mean, it's a relatively new field that developed from the science of psychology, and then the art of counseling has kind of come through that. And you have, you know, social work, you have a lot of branches of that. And so I think we're still evolving in that way. And yes, I do feel like that is exactly the fulcrum point where I have found myself landing, is that bridge between those worlds, the bridge between the intellectual, the institutional kind of Western global North idea of, you know, like you said, rationalism and evidence-based practices, which is important and has its place. And at the same time, there is deep wisdom that is the nonlinear, body-based, earth-based, you know, wisdom, mythology, storytelling-based, you know, ways of being that can't always be measured in a lot of these, you know, the studies, you know, the ways of being that blank slate, you know. So it's my thought is like it's both of those are important. It's not either or. It's not the extremes of either one. It's like really about being a bridge. And so this fulcrum point of being a bridge is where myself and I think a growing number of people in this field or from kind of both sides are seeing. And in a lot of the indigenous traditions that I work with, I'm seeing that too. It's like where the people that have been the wisdom keepers in these lineages from the Pan-American continents, from, you know, even Europe and Africa and Asia, you know, it's, you know, there's like wait a minute, we need to bridge. How do we bridge these things? How do we not forget the old way, you know, is this new way? And this is interesting too, and because I've thought about this, I think about things in like arcs of development and where are patterns. I'm always looking for patterns. And if you look at the way, you know, a human being or most, you know, animals develop, you know, you start with like a nervous system heartbeat, and then you get the brain stem, and then that develops into the nervous system, and then, you know, baby's born and it's very somatic. It's very just in its body. It doesn't care about words. It's not doing that. It's just responding to the signals in its body that help it get what it needs in order to survive, which is like safety, connection, food, you know, belonging, all of that. And then it gets older and it discovers its own body. And then then in the prefrontal cortex, the place of rational cognitive thought and the filtering of our emotions comes in, where our core beliefs get installed. And it's then we get this like higher thought. When I say higher, I literally just mean like, up at the top of the body. It's not hierarchical at all. And so what I've seen is like if you look at the arc of history over the past few hundred years, there's been a disconnect between this like cognitive rational place and then the body and the beautiful story and the narrative function of just like the body and the heart and the spirit moving through the world without the need for a rational understanding. And there's been a split between the two. And now I see like there's a desire to like bring those two back together, because we need all of those parts in order to function holistically and integratively in this world that's also continuing to evolve.
That's a fascinating idea. It's just even to bring this idea of saying like body and mind have been separated, or mind and spirit, or body and spirit. The idea that those are even separable is dubious to me. Like,
right.
It's funny. Yeah. It's a trick of our brain that there's an easy way to explain what's happening, but there's also things like alexithymia where this comes up. Or for me, for a long time, I was very above the neck. In fact, I was only above the neck. There was me, and then there was this thing.
Yeah.
And there are good reasons for that, where that could be adaptive that I've learned. But it also, there's a safe place because I could be very rational, and that seems, safe in a way. I guess it did for me at a time. And getting down into the body, and again, it's weird because I think that like from the point of like science, it's not possible to separate them, but it's a metaphor that's still useful for me to understanding, well, this is what the problem is. Your mind, your brain is not really telling you what's happening in your body. What's the process like? Like, I imagine that's a lot of your work is helping people come back to the body to feel safe.
Yeah.
Is there a playbook for that in like the Western tradition? Or because I imagine you're pulling from everything to do that. But like, if someone went and became trained to be a therapist right now, do you think they would say, well, this is how you do that?
I think anyone who is really attuned to the profession is not going to say, here's the one path,
right.
And here's the thing too, like those of us in the work, we don't have to be skilled at every single thing for us to be able to be a capsule of wisdom to carry this profession forward, or, in the same way with, other more earth-based or indigenous traditions. For example, we don't need everyone to be a trauma therapist. Someone can also be a developmental therapist. Someone can be a grief therapist, and that's okay, because that helps people find the entry point for their broader integrative healing. Now, to be informed about all that, I think is important, to be like, this is what I do, but it is not the path. And having evidence-based research is really helpful, because there are charlatan claims out there on both sides, both in the clinical and in the metaphysical, or more, it's like there's still stuff that's like, oh, actually this doesn't really work, so let's vet that. So it is important to have that. At the same time, that is important to have like an explorative mind of like, well, let's see. And to also hold room for that there's things that cannot be proven by evidence-based science right now, because we just don't have that. But to come back to your question, is there a playbook for that? No, I don't think I think it's being written.
Still being written.
Like, I think, we're constantly updating it. If you look back, a lot of people consider Freud to be like the grandfather of modern psychology. And, that's that sort of certain lens of history, but it's certainly not that there's certainly so much more than that. But if you even look at that, his work at the time was, profound and revelatory, but we've since been like, oh, he was really off the mark on plenty of this.
Did way too much cocaine.
Just
gave him the best ideas and the worst ideas all at the same time.
Right, yes. Yeah. But what it did was created a branch of
it's
growth.
A way of thinking about the mind.
Yeah. And even in that arc, we can be like, wow, we can get rid of a lot of his claims even, and still not discredit like what has grown from that, if that makes sense. Yeah. So that's why I'm just like, the playbook keeps being written, but that's why it's so important to be on this edge, this bridge. Like, we're constantly, like, if you think about the mind and the evolution of the mind and the growth of thought, you're constantly having like synapses and neural networks formed. So we're just like these little nodes that are like continuing to bridge information and create current between one point of information and another. So for me, I'm like, well, this is what I have. How can I continue to create a bridge to like a bridge to other information. And not just knowledge in the brain sense, but knowledge from the sense of like gnosis, like GNOSIS, which is like body-based knowledge. It's what cannot be written in a book. You know, not all of this is going to be able to be put in a book. And that's why I think it's so important to come back to our bodies, because I can't write how to be in presence in a book in the same way that you can write an instruction manual on exactly how to build a bike, how to sit on a bike, how to pedal a bike. But you can't teach, like, that. What cannot be taught is that, or put in a book, is what it feels like to get on the bike and find your balance and fall a few times and then find your center of gravity. There's no book that can teach you that. You have to get on the bike and you ride it. And so that's why being back in connection with our bodies is so important. And why it's the bridging from just talk-based therapy to this body-based, somatic, mythological, I call it like the, you probably hear this term a lot, of just like the animate forces of this world, the animate mythos of the body, and the way that our bodies create a narrative between ourselves and other bodies, not just human bodies, but like me and this cup. There's a narrative happening at the interface of my body and this cup right now. And that's a felt sense. And so that is why I focus so much on like helping people come back to the body, and that it's safe to trust it, that it's safe to listen to what it has to say. And we do that by recreating situations where safety is held, which comes from our own inner work of becoming safe for ourselves. And then as soon as we can become safe for ourselves, that's when we can extend and create the safety for other people to just, I can drop into this. I can fully inhabit this body. I can fully inhabit this moment. And it takes time.
Yeah, I love like most of the time on this podcast, someone will say something like you just did, and there will be like 7 or 8 different things like that I could just go down.
Yeah.
One of the ones I loved so much was you were just talking about learning how to ride a bike. I use this metaphor a lot. Actually, I use the metaphor of swinging a golf club. So like a lot of men my age just kind of grasp that's a very technical, hard thing to do, but it's a great way of explaining how neural pathways are developed and how you can't unlearn something.
Yeah.
Like you can't really, you'll once you learn to ride a bike, you'll never go back to not knowing how. You can get rusty at it, but it comes right back. You know, that the pathways have been laid. And that's also how I've been trying, and it's funny the way that I'm thinking now, what you're describing is there are some things that just can't be described. That really can't be explained. A lot of it's my challenge of trying to tell people why I love a photograph. It really comes down to how I feel when I see it. And if you can't see the photograph I'm looking at, I can describe it to you all day. Yeah. I've had one person that was like, just tell me what the photograph is about. And I'm like, no, on principle, I'm not going to just describe it to you because you won't feel it. But I've had this experience a lot, and I've been trying to explain it to people or find a framework, which is that sometimes I'll realize I forgot to feel guilty. Or I forgot, like there's an old neural pathway. It's like, oh, wait. I almost got sucked down this one hallway that I used to always automatically go down. But now like I have another option available to me. But in the moment, sometimes there's a feeling of, you ever be like, oh my God, I think I forgot to turn the stove off. That kind of feeling of like, wait, I forgot to do something important in the moment. And I'll go like, oh, wait, I think I just forgot to feel guilty for having a good time. And it's a really strange sensation because it does feel like there's a path I could go down.
Yes. Yeah.
And this is one of these things where someone could have explained that to me in terms of neurobiology all they wanted until I knew what it felt like. It wouldn't have really mattered if I could intellectualize it or not. But that's kind of what the path of trauma integration and like rewiring is, that I've laid down new pathways and learned how to do that. Yeah. So you mentioned movement as like a modality that you use primarily, and it makes a lot of sense with like body practices. What does that look like for you and like in your life, and just also when you're working with clients? I mean, do you just get up and say, let's move?
No, it's usually a little more structured or intentional than that with clients. I mean, for me, it's come from a lot of self-experimentation of just like, over the last 5 years, being immersed in freeform dance community, whether that be, it started for me more intentionally during COVID, during the shutdown I was home all the time, working virtually all the time, had a 7-year-old at home, and it was just me and her. And I was like, oh my gosh, it was hard. We were not doing a whole lot. And I was starting to feel, I think there was a collective freeze and withdrawing that was happening all over the world. And everything in my body rebelled against it. I was like, this doesn't feel good. And, I think my whole life I've been pretty sensitive and connected to my body, but have had periods of time through my own story, through the hardships, the traumas that have like taken me out of my body, and I've had to learn how to come back in. And so, whether, just depending on how you look at it, whether it was like intuition or, for me, my perspective is much more animate and beyond this physical realm than, science would describe them, like, or I could have been like guided or supported in this, like, okay, get in your body and move. So I started dancing, and I was part of, some online dancing communities. And so then we developed Ecstatic Dance Nashville here, which Ecstatic Dance is kind of a broader, organization that's global, but really it's just about dancing, not from like a way of choreography or steps, but like reversing the point of attention, which is like, what is happening inside of you? How are you being asked to move from the inside out rather than from the outside in? And so that really was a big journey for me to like come back home to my body, move stories through the body, out of the body that no longer to be there, change the story, rewrite the story. And when I say story, I do mean like some stories that can be put in from words into writing or words into speaking, but it's more energetic, like all of it's energy. It's like, the stories that we tell like create energy in our bodies. It can lock up muscles, create tension, and cause our fascia to cinch, cause our, knees to hurt. Because when hard things happen or traumas happen, if we don't move that energy out of our body, it can like create like locks in our system, or patterns of dissociation or fight flight that continue to loop. And so when we actually inhabit our body and move that energy through and out, we release a story, we complete a story, and we allow the spaciousness opens up to rewrite a new story through neural pathways, which whether it's talking or movement. So that for me, like my personal practice with movement, everything from, I used to push myself really hard. I used to like run marathons and do like intense trainings, and was like really focused on being like this, like, it was like a very hardened way of living. And it was like, I don't want to do that anymore. Like I want a softer way of being, and not soft as in passive, but just more fluid and more embodied to what this body wants. And coming into that and really learning to like love that experience, love my own body, love the story that it wants to live in this life, listen to it. I was like, my clients need this. My clients really need this. So I've done different things, whether it's yoga, contemplative dance practice, this intuitive movement, getting out in nature and feeling myself respond to that environment. I've developed these modalities and techniques or methods for my clients that I'm working on refining right now through a lot of practice with my clients, where we really are following that arc of development of just like, okay, what is the very first thing that you do when you come out of the womb? You cry. You take a breath in and you cry. And so we focus the first part of our somatic, body inhabiting work is like just learning to breathe. Like what happens when you fully fill up your lungs and fully release. And then, I'll take them through movements. If you've seen like babies, like they discover their hands and their feet, and they're just like exploring these appendages. And so I have these like really focused practices on how to do that. And then it develops into like, okay, now what is your interface like with your body? What is your interface like with your body and another person, or your body and another object? And then kind of like, toddlers toddle, and then they get balance. And then it's this whole full or deeper expression. And we get into like adolescence and adulthood. And then so that, is like understanding like erotic energy in a different way that's outside of like maybe conditionings around sexuality and things we've been taught. And so really it's all about this interface of your own self, your own witness in your body. And it's really beautiful. Like people will, along the path and along the different points of this process, I have one client who it was like the first time he took a full breath. As soon as he exhaled, he started weeping. And for another client, it was like, okay, when they were finally able to stand up and stretch their arms out fully, and then they just kind of broke down into laughter. And so there's all types of different entry points that are like the place that like opens up the emotional experience. But it's important, I find, to go through that whole arc.
So I'm curious about this interface that you're describing. So you mentioned it a few times now. It's the animate part of ourselves. You're saying like there's an interface between you and the cup.
It's the interface between self and other, or self and self. It's the relational field. It's like, me and this microphone, me and you right now. There's this interface that's happening. And at that interface, sometimes, it's physical, like I'm touching this table right now. Other times it's energetic or conversational. Anytime, you go for a walk in the woods, you're now at an interface with the ground you're stepping upon, the trees that are there, the wind that's blowing through. There's an interaction between yourself and the animate forces of this world. And at that place, there's an alchemy of story. And that's the place to be like, what is the story that is happening here? And you look at all of these indigenous traditions, and they don't, so many of them don't speak about life in the same way we do. For example, there's certain Native American languages out in the Southwest where there's not a word for wind. There's a word, there's these sounds and phrases that's like, well, it's like the wind in the morning at dawn, or the wind that comes with the snow, or like the wind as it moves through her hair. Like there's not just wind. It's all about the animate interaction with that force and the thing it's interacting with. And so there's many languages and different traditions that speak about life that way. And it creates a paradigm that we understand the world through. The English language and the way that we've constructed it, it doesn't have that much poetry to it. We create poetry with our words, but it's a different. We don't have as much animism and fluidity in it in the same way. So that's what I'm really interested in exploring, and I want to know the poetry between self and other. What shows up there? What's the story? What's the inner mythology? Who are the characters in there? What are the stories they're playing out? How did your system discover fire? What does your system tell you about fire? Do you carry a story of Prometheus in you about fire, or is it Pele? The Hawaiian goddess of volcano. It's like there's always these stories about fire, and what is the one that's here? And that's what I'm get curious about. And in trauma therapy, that's what the focus is a lot on. Is like, what is for example, if I'm working with someone with a deep attachment wound and they have some deep trauma, maybe who knows what it could be. They developed a narrative, a story about like what it means to attach and connect to another person. Maybe they lost a parent when they were 7 years old or something, and so they learned that the story of attachment is painful. And so every time they get close to attachment, they feel a burning in their system because their system remembers pain. And so like we're going there. It's like, well, let's explore that story. What's it like to tell that story, to feel it? And now let's animate it. What is the animate story of that? And how do you want to change it? How do you want to shift it? How do you want to move differently within it? And that's the interface that I value so much in this work.
And does trauma disrupt that? Like, is that a way of thinking of trauma? It's just a disruption of our ability to interface with others?
I think that's a little too simplistic, because, there's an interference. We all are going to have interferences in life. I have not yet met a single person that has gotten the perfect type of attachment, that there's no rupture or disruption. Now, there's degrees of it for sure. There are degrees that prevent, the ability to develop and attach in a certain way. But we all have something. And so that's the other thing, like in my clinical work, I have intentionally steered away from diagnostic lenses. I'm grateful for it. Like the DSM, it's a living document. It's always changing, always being updated. I definitely refer to it, but I hold it loosely in the sense that like sometimes it can create too much rigidity for people's experience. Like, that is one way to interpret your story. And sometimes that is a really helpful lens to interpret a story through. It can create structure if structure is really needed. But there's many other ways to experience your story. How do you want to tell it? What paradigm do you want to tell it through?
Yeah, that's powerful. I mean, it really comes down to, I guess, the person's own personal sense of narrative about their own life. And it's interesting. I love that. I mean, I want to be a filmmaker. So like, I definitely relate to the idea of like narrative.
Yeah.
It is, it feels really empowering to hear you talk about it in a way that is about people being able to rewrite those narratives or to overwrite those narratives is a beautiful thing. I'm wondering if you mentioned some things like Pele, for example. I'm so fascinated by these like myth and a lot of, film studies involves a lot of that, like Joseph Campbell and his monomyth. And that's what Star Wars is basically, the hero's journey and all of Carl Jung's work. Do you find that like, is that the way that I guess it would be like in indigenous cultures, they just kind of have these myths and they're just out there and we're all responding to them? Do you think that other than what we're doing here in the West, is that the dominant worldview, do you think, of life, is that people aren't in our natural state? Are we thinking in terms of myth and story?
Can you say that again?
Yeah, like, I mean, we were telling stories around the campfire for a long time before we were on Freud's couch.
Right.
And do you think like the way we have the DSM is this manual of diagnoses that are of dubious validity, but they sound awfully scientific. It's a way of medicalizing the human experience. And that's very recent. And it seems like it's kind of crowded out the way that it seems like a more natural way for us to relate to our experience, which is, am I the hero in my own story or am I not?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's room for both, and there's room for them being like living, changing documents. I mean, that's the thing about like myth too, and like one of the, like my dear teachers and traditions from the Amazon and the Huni Queen, they have stories, and they were mostly an oral tradition until maybe two generations ago when their language started to be put into written form. And so when you have all these oral traditions, there's going to be constant change to the story. But the essence of the thread kind of remains the same, even if it braids into the tapestry over time differently. So I think there was just like this inherent, like, oh yeah, there's little things that shift and change, but the essence is what's carried through. And so in oral traditions, it was like, when someone became a story carrier or becomes a story carrier, it's like, do they understand the essence of the story? And even if they get some of the details different in each telling, is the essence conveyed? And then that was usually kind of the thing that would define a really good story carrier, is like, can they carry the essence or the heart of this story rather than the factual accuracy? And so that's something that the DSM or the medical models do that is really helpful. It's like the accuracy that can be proven through different types of experimentation and research, because it is important to have that sometimes, and also to hold it loosely. It is not the end all be all. It is not at the top of a hierarchy, and that the DSM is also a living document that changes based on our paradigm. I mean, there were diagnoses in there, in the 50s that, for example, like homosexuality used to be in the DSM as a disorder. And it was like, okay, so that was reflective of a certain belief system at the time. And like, imagine if we were like, nope, this is gospel, this is the way it is. And so if you kind of take that idea and overlay that on any other important text that has come through time, and how when there have been people that have said, no, this is literal gospel, this is the way it is, and it cannot be changed or interpreted in any other way than literally, without the ability to let it change and shift and evolve in the way that we let story and myth telling happen, and to realize, it's a way, like, what is the essence of what's really being conveyed here? That's the part that I would just caution against. I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, it does. It's funny you mentioned this, you said the word literal gospel, because that's what I was thinking about when you were saying people understood that this was true, but like it would, the details may not matter, they may change.
Yeah.
And that was, as scholars say, that was always how people understood the Gospels until the mid 19th century when Darwin came along, and then biblical literalism happened, but that was never a thing before. People just kind of understood that, like, it was the good news. It wasn't meant to be.
I don't know. I think people took it quite literally before
did? You
then.
think they did?
Oh yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
look at the way that like the harm that was done through. I mean, there was that's a whole different conversation.
Well, yeah, I
There's
guess
been
because
plenty
I mean, if you choose to take something literally, you can be kind of selective about which ones you care about, right? And you can say, well, this is the part that mattered. They didn't want people to read it for most of
Right.
history. Like
That was the thing,
they wouldn't
yeah.
print it in a book anybody knew how to read. Yeah, so it does enable you to be like, just trust me, I know what this means. It's interesting. That seems to be a feature of traditions like Christianity or Islam, where it's a written document. Oral traditions don't seem to have this problem of orthodoxy, because how could they?
Right.
So they're freer. It's dawning on me in this moment. It's a beautiful way to do it. I'm wondering if we have any modern myths that have come about, like, are the things that are happening now or have happened recently that will be the myths that they'll talk about in future generations?
Oh, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Like we're in it right now. We're in a mythology creation right now, and it's like there's a lot of overlapping timelines that seem to be happening, where if you zoom back far enough, you can like, oh, I see what's happening. Like, and I think, some of like the things to ask is like, what does a culture see as most important? Where does money flow? Where does abundance flow? Who gets worshipped? And so it's very easy to see like where it's around attention. Where does attention go? And so if you zoom back and you look at where is our attention, those are going to become the deities of this mythology, And
where do you think our culture here in the United States is giving its attention? I mean, I'm curious. Like, it's our attention is. I'd say our biggest problem is that our attention is horribly scattered.
Right now, it's really scattered, right? And that's part of where I think there's like a lot of disillusion happening, is because it's like, where do we even focus? It's kind of what creates the vulnerabilities for other things to come in to capture our attention and focus and distract us from coming back inside. So if I can speak about that, I feel like we're at this pivotal moment where we're being faced with this choice. Like, do you want to go inward and find your inner core here and come back home to this? Or do you want to keep outsourcing to something external to tell you where to put your attention? And I think that's always been there in some degree or another, but we're at a pretty significant place with that, considering like technology and the way information flows at this moment. And so I think like this somatic work is really, it's like, okay, that's a pathway back to this inner awareness, this inner source of attention, which is the source of all light. To go back to one of the very first things we said of like many rays from a single source. There is one source of light, and we all carry a facet of that within our being. Or we can continue to be scattered and refracted out here. So then to kind of answer your question, is like, what is being placed what is being put in our world to call our attention? Well, on one hand, you have like constant focus on disaster, constant focus on the horrible, awful things that are happening. And two things to say to that: there are horrible, awful things that are happening that we're seeing more of, and also that like it's more because we have the ability to see it and hear about it more often. There have always been really horrible, awful things that have happening. They're just coming to the surface now. This is unfortunately always been there, and there's a lot of really awful stuff that humans do to each other. There's more things at play now than maybe like certain technologies are at play that we not always had. But yeah, these are human traits. Unfortunately, we do these things, but we just are seeing more of it now. So disasters, horrible things, celebrity culture, that's a whole thing. Like those become like these, like this drama that's played out in front of us that pulls us out from our own lives. The kind of the obsession with like youth, that's been a thing for a long time. It's pretty foundational in the kind of the last 300 years of whatever culture has been established. I mean, like even what Ponce de Leon chasing the fountain of youth in Florida.
Right.
Like,
yeah, that's right. That's kind of part of this founding of this country, was the search for eternal youth.
Right. Yeah. So that thread has been here for a long time. And so it's like this external chasing of something. So that's kind of created this mythology. And so I think when we look back, we'll see, like once the distillation process has happened, you know, we'll be able to look back in 100 years, and I'm sure someone or AI will write about it.
Right. And they'll tell us, and well, AI will write it, and then we'll get another AI to read it and make sure it wasn't plagiarized.
Right.
So you start off this conversation talking about how you see things in cycles. Do you look at history and time in the same way? Like, I know there are different ways of doing that, different traditions, the Mayan calendar and things. How do you relate to thinking about time and the passage of time and cycles?
Big question, small question. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, I think about time a lot, you know, and the cycles of time, and that's something, learning in about the Mayan calendar and their way of thinking about time, which I'm like just, you know, barely scratching the surface on that. It's complex and beautiful. But yes, seeing it as cyclical rather than linear, and not only cyclical, but like interlocking, and there's multiple cycles happening in an interlocking way all at once. And I do think that, you know, I mean, we can get pretty far out here with this topic, but, you know, I do think that there's the way that our human form experiences an arc of birth and death. And that is just one little cycle in many types of cycles. I think there are, you know, bigger cosmic cycles. I think there's I mean, we look at everything. Everything operates in a cycle. Everything, nature, seasons, everything is spinning around and around and around and going. It's in a circle or a spiral. So I think there are themes that come up over again. I think there are timelines that intersect and interact. I mean, the deeper that I go into this work, and I stay pretty grounded. I kind of say, like, my feet are on the ground, but I'm looking, you know, at the expanded view of consciousness and reality all the time. But I'm pretty anchored here. You know, it's like, yep, still gotta eat, still gotta sleep, still gotta look left and right before crossing the street, because I don't, you know, there's things like, yeah, we're here. This is the human experience. This body gets sick, it gets happy, it feels pleasure and pain, you know, all of those things. But there's an expansive way that is not in that linear dense format. And yeah, I think we have the ability, that's the other thing that, like, I think somatically and emotionally, we have the ability to change that's how I think we have the ability to change our stories. It's kind of a little, you know, I'd say this little tongue in cheek, but also real, like it's a bit of like time travel to go in and impact the story that we carry in our body right now. And it's like we can release that trauma, and which is essentially, like, I frame it as like going back to a moment in time where a trauma happened, and bringing the presence that you needed at that time that would have altered the way that moment impacted your life. Because one thing that we talk about in the clinical world with trauma too, and I know now we're from time to trauma, we're over here now, is that, you know, trauma is less about what happened to you and more how you were held and how you, like, who was there for you and how you were handled, or how it was handled after the thing happened, you know, because it's yes, there can be things that are traumatic inherently, but like, how were you met? How did someone support you? How were you supported? What were the belief systems you had about yourself? You know, and that really alters the way that trauma embeds itself in your psyche and your body and affects your experience over time. So when we do this work now, when we shift the relationship to our stories now, it does impact those stories. And I mean, in the clinical world, they're not going to say it like this, but I do think it quite literally is like we're time traveling. We are impacting the past. And then I think there's a ripple effect from that. It can not only impact your experience, but like maybe other lives that were impacted by your experience in small ways. And this gets at like real quantum and quantum physics kind of theories. But I just from what I've seen and what I've come to understand about the way that energy works, the way that matter works, the way that time works, it's like all completely plausible, while also making sure that I get groceries in my fridge on time.
Right. It's such a beautiful contradiction that you're thinking those things while you're also going through these so mundane.
Yeah.
You're sitting in traffic, you're in Nashville or whatever, getting the groceries. I love the idea of time travel, like trauma integration as time travel. It just sounds like an adventure. Like, again, it's like reframing narrative of like, what does this work? It's something that maybe you get to do instead of something you have to do. I've also been thinking a lot about things being frozen in time, and this in the lens of trauma. There's this book that's on my list that's never going to end of books I'm supposed to read, but it's called Trauma in the Soul. Have you read that?
I haven't read it, but I've heard of it.
I saw it in a video that was explaining dissociative identity disorder. And that this idea from the book Trauma in the Soul is that trauma fragments ourself, and the fragments, the fractured pieces, are frozen in time. And that kind of pertains to, we started off talking about how people are all a multiplicity of parts, right? That some of those parts are frozen, traumatized children often. And so it's almost not necessarily like time traveling because they're still in the past, but they're today. Like we carry the past with us, and it's in a very real sense, and you can kind of work with it in the here and now. When I've done a lot of that kind of work over the years, it's kind of come to define my life. And what I found is that often the hardest part for me is that when I get there, it's like something blocks me from wanting to. Or specifically, what I'm blocked from is offering the kind of containment or care that I would have needed at that time. I feel like I can't do it now, and I feel blocked from doing that. And I've learned that that's because we have like layers of emotion, and we have emotions about emotion. We have meta emotions. So maybe sometimes you feel like I don't deserve to feel better. And then there's this whole other set of narratives there, and it's just like it's like a bottomless well of complexity, which we are, and it's the thing I love about people the most. But it again makes me appreciate much more what you're saying, that like the work that you do. There's something to me that seems, the word clinical, often I use that word to mean cold or sterile. You know what I mean? Like sometimes, like aesthetically, if I don't like a room, I'm like, this room's too clinical. I don't like it. You know what I mean? And it almost seems perverse to refer to what you do in these terms. Because there is something that is more mythic or more spiritual to it. And for me, really the thing that finally, when things started changing for me, was when I finally was like, okay, I'll try the spirituality thing, because I'd done everything else. I'd run out of. I was like, I exhausted all the alternatives, and I was like, okay, I'll stand on my head. I'll do whatever I got to do. So it's beautiful that you get to do this work. How does it relate to? You haven't always been a therapist, right? I think by my count, you've done it for about 10 years.
I've had my private practice for 10 years.
But what were you doing before that?
And before then, when I moved here to Nashville in 2008 until I started my private practice, I was mostly doing nonprofit work. I was working in community mental health. I was working a lot with like the unhoused community, people with what is called like severe and persistent mental illness, like really intense experiences of like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder that have like resulted in them not being able to like function and live in a way that allows them to take care of their bodies or be in like healthy community and relationships, which led to like doing a lot of work in the prisons, and worked in the women's prison on the seg unit.
What is the seg unit?
The segregation unit, where it's like the people that are there on life or on death row. Okay. And so I was the therapist for that part of the women's prison here for, honestly, it was less than a year, to be honest. It was hard work. And like also at the time, like being a single solo parent, like after just going through divorce, it was like, I can't do this and run a private practice and parent well and be attuned. It was too much. But it was like the culmination of this work of kind of continuing to follow this path of working with the people who lived at the margins. And that is where I think my spiritual path really started, was, being under bridges in, 3-degree weather and finding someone cold who gave someone colder their own coat, and so it was just like, oh my God, there's this beautiful aspect of humanity. And I mean, I get tearful just touching into the tenderness of it, that it's like, that the heart the heart of humanity. Like, no matter what you do to this body, like this heart cannot be, you can't touch that. You can't take it. Now, do people close off and shut down? Absolutely. But what I witnessed in these places, what I witnessed in the prisons, what I witnessed on the streets was that there's like this beautiful crystalline quality of the human heart that is sometimes found most purely in the margins, where you have people who have lost everything, who a community has outcast, who has said, you are nothing. We literally ignore you when we walk past you on the street because we don't know how to interact with you. We don't know how to interface with you because you don't fit into the mythology or the paradigm that we have been conditioned to see as normal or okay or acceptable. Or maybe we've been conditioned with a story that says, be afraid of you. And then to go there and then like tap into my own humanity, tap into where I've held my own judgments or fears, and then to recognize like just the subtle shifts in my life that determined whether I ended up there or whether I ended up on this path that I got into college on scholarship and did, and what I saw there was it was something subtle. It was like community. It was having a safety net of people that cared enough to make sure that I didn't fall through the cracks. Because in my teen years, I could have very well gone down that pathway. I was deep into, a lot of choices and a lot of life that would not have lended me the opportunities that are apparent to me now in my 40s. That for people, like when I ran into people in the streets or in prisons, like, yeah, they didn't, it was like a few things, community, resource. They didn't have that, and they ended up in these physical situations that most of us would find pretty daunting. So that's what I spent a lot of like my formative years in this field doing, is really being with people in humanity, listening to the stories of people who are ignored, listening to the stories of people that are often passed over, and this kind of goes back to that place of mythos and mythology and story. It's like recognizing like, oh my God, there's a deeper story here. There's one of humanity. There's the story of the human heart. And so that's one reason why I also continue to connect with the mythologies and stories of indigenous cultures, because there's a story, like the essence, if we go back to that, the essence of stories is like coming back to the human heart. Like there's something really precious about the quality that we carry within us it's not tangible, but it's a felt and inhabited way of being that happens when we're inside of the vessel of the body. This vessel of the body holds the energy, the frequency of the heart, of love. And that's what I kept seeing over and over again is, that caring for this vessel and this body is the way that we continue to create room for this heart, but it also penetrates all of that. So to answer then, like, the piece around the story and myth, part of that early work too, this is also helping me see a thread and refine a thread for myself. With that early work, so much of it was like finding the most vulnerable people. Like we would go out and we would interview folks on the street and be like, hey, who's the person that's sickest the most? Who's the person that's in and out of jail the most? Who's the 19-year-old pregnant mother who's addicted to crack? Let's find her. Let's get her story. And so we would get the story, by building a relationship through trust, by presence, like being in presence. Let's we'd show up, no books, no clipboards, no anything. And we're like, we're here to be with you. We have snacks and cigarettes. Great, I'm with you. And then over time, there would be trust built. And then through that trust, then they would share their story about what happened, how they got there. And then in the listening to that story, we'd get enough information to create a narrative that was based on their story. And then from that, we could then track their medical records and then create a traceable, paper trail for then like the Social Security Administration or some other administrations to then be like, oh, okay, now they qualify for this funding. Now they qualify for this housing voucher. And so then we could get them into a place where they could finally be held and supported a little bit more by life, and then get them on a track, if they wanted to, for a more resourced and supportive life. So that was really kind of the beginning of this external work. Prior to that, so much of my own wounding was because people interpreted me through their projections of who they thought I was. They see this, young girl going down the bad track and using drugs and living in a group home, and there's a story that's attached to that. I wasn't allowed to come into a private school that my parents tried to get me into after I returned from all of that, because I didn't look the part. And so, but I was like a brilliant, creative, smart, sensitive person, but I didn't carry the story. I didn't look like the story that fit into their paradigm and narrative. So that's always been a part of what I want to do, is like, what is the story of this heart? What is the heart of this? And so that really, I can trace that thread as being the linking point between all that early work and my constantly shifting roles of, like, being this advocate and like hardcore, grinding, working 14, 15-hour days in my 20s, and then the chapter of like being a mother and having to go through a total identity shift and let all that behind and be like, oh, guess I'm focused on being a mother for a while, and then building the private practice. And now I feel like I'm in this other place of like, well, what's next? I'm not sure, but I feel the scaffolding of what was kind of starting to fray a little bit. And then I'm just being curious about what is going to be built from this. What's next? How do I carry this legacy forward? I know that's a long answer.
I love that answer. I was thinking a lot about just the way you were talking about story with people, and it's almost like the people stay the same, but the story changes. The story we tell about them changes. Like, in one moment, this person is not eligible for housing, and in another moment they are.
Exactly.
And, right? But it's the same person.
Yeah.
Or assuming there is such a thing as like one unified self through time.
Sure.
But, and I can relate a lot to what you were saying when you were younger. People had a story of who they thought you were based on probably very little information that may have been false. But then you're somehow affected by that. And I can see how you would have this ambivalence about psychiatric diagnosis, because it does kind of reduce people's whole story down to a fixed idea about who they are. And yet, and this is also, I always start my podcast with the same question. How do you answer this question? What do you do? Because that's really another way of, when people ask, they could just say, so what's your story? Although it seems kind of rude, the way I say it's like, what's your story? But really, it might be a more revealing question to ask people. And I'm wondering, and that's mostly what I think I'm getting at on this podcast. I like to hear people tell their story of who they are and what they're interested in.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm wondering what led you to want to do the work that you did as a therapist, become a therapist, and then go into the nonprofit work that you did. What was that calling like for you?
Well, I think I always wanted to. I mean, there's a few different threads. I think the three predominant threads is like I've always been a helper. Like, I've always wanted to help people. I've had a deep empathetic heart. I remember being a child and, being raised in like a religious framework, there was a lot about compassion and caring, but I naturally was just like cared a lot. I remember probably being like 6 and driving through San Francisco with my parents and like seeing people pushing a grocery cart, and I was like, what's going on? And like they explained what was going on, and I remember my heart just broke, being like, what do you mean they don't have homes? What do you mean that that's all their belongings? And so I think I've always cared about people, and just being very deeply sensitive and attuned. Life has always had a mystical feeling to it, that there's always something deeper. I've had a yearning to know what's deeper, like what, there's something deeper. And I think that's been, even my dark times in my early life were from seeking something deeper, of like, there's got to be something more to this. And then the other piece is, I think it's part of my lineage and my purpose here. I didn't know it at the time, but I'm carrying a torch forward. My grandfather, my mom's father, he was a psychiatrist, and he grew up as like a peanut farmer in the Mississippi Delta, and was one of the first person in his family to like go to college and like get a deeper education. He was in the army, and lived in Germany. But when he came back, he developed his medical practice and then became a psychiatrist, and then was part of the founding board of the first psychiatric hospital in Mississippi. And then, he was seeing clients pretty, like non-typical clients, but like he would see LGBTQ clients, before that was really accepted.
Wow, way before, yeah.
Yeah.
It was a mental illness back then.
Right.
Like you could be locked up for it. Yeah.
Yeah. And his clients loved him because he would meet them there. He would, and he struggled with his own stuff too. Like he was not a perfect man, but I think he had a really good heart. And, you know, I think I remember my mom telling me a story about one time her mom was like taking her and her siblings to church, and they walked past their dad's office and saw him like oming and doing transcendental meditation in the office, and how just like kerfluffled her mom was, and like it was like Southern
This would be
Methodist.
What, like the 1950s, 60s?
This is like the 60s.
60s.
Yeah,
Okay, yeah, makes sense. Makes more sense. Yeah.
Right. And so like
But
I
it's
think
still in Mississippi.
it was in Mississippi
You're
in
right.
the 60s
Yeah.
in Jackson, Mississippi. And so
Right.
yeah, so it was definitely avant-garde, and definitely ruffled my dear sweet grandmother's feathers, who was very, you know, Christ United Methodist Church. There were ways to do things. But they're both deeply beautiful spiritual beings. And I think just, you know, in our human bumbling ways, they kind of were part of this path for me. He's always been a guide for me. He passed in 2015, and I have felt him like, oh, I get choked up when I think about it too. I've felt him guiding from the other side, because I know that if that is true, and this could be my own myth that I'm creating about like the felt sense of guidance from him, but he knows that there was like a karmic wake that he left as part of just his life, his legacy, his family, his choices he made in life. And I really do believe that that's another thing indigenous cultures teach us, is how to honor our ancestors, how to listen, how they're there as our guides and our supports. And we've really cut ourselves off from that in our kind of global north in institutionalized learning, because there's like, well, prove it. I'm like, well, you can't prove it. It's a felt thing. You feel it. I feel him there. I feel his guiding hand. I feel his support in everything I've done. You know, and speaking of time travel, even though he was living at the time when, you know, I was younger up until 2015, I can see how there's a bit of an arc of like, oh, you're going back and you're affecting all these things too. You're helping me usher something forward. It's much bigger than me. I just happen to be the specific conduit for this particular ray of light that's coming through. And my work is to just clear and continue to clear and open the aperture of my heart and take care of this body and mind and soul, so that what wants to come through me can just come through. It's actually a lot less doing and more about just opening the heart.
Right. So like allowing something to happen instead of making it happen. I can relate to that idea a lot. It's funny, as you were saying that your grandfather did this work, I was thinking that sounds very shamanistic. It's a very lineage, and especially healers. And this seems to be ubiquitous almost across every culture, that people that are healers, it's almost kind of like a family business, but of course they don't think of it as a business. They think of it as a lineage and like an endowment. Like it's their work. And it's cool to hear that from a Mississippi shaman, like basically, you know what I mean?
I mean,
like,
it does. That Mississippi River medicine, I'm saying, and it is like, whew, and the Delta has some medicine too, you know, it's like, you know, as a white person and with a white family from the Mississippi Delta, I mean, there was like, that was an intersection of time where there was some raw, rough stuff happening in history at that time. And I really think that, you know, my grandfather tried to do something different than like the predominant narrative at the time, and really tried to turn an arc, like turn something, and, you know, did his absolute best. And that is interesting. I mean, I tend to kind of use the term shaman lightly. You know, I tend to think that is one of, like, I understand the essence of what it is. Like, yeah, I am walking in that path. And also, I'm not going to call myself a shaman. I'm not going to put that on my Instagram profile. I'm not going to say that. You know, the only time, you know, it's like, if I had a teacher in that lineage command me to, like, you take this title and use it, I'd be like, okay. But if that moment, I'm not going to do that, because it's like, for me, it's like, it's more important to live the essence of what that is. And I know I'm clear on what that is. And that's what I show up with. And that's the work I do. And I'm bridging these paradigms of this clinical world. Like, I can't just go out and do the things that I do in my ceremonies or my more mystical traditions in a clinical setting and expect it to be met and understood, because that's like, no, like if my purpose is to really connect people to this, then I need to be on the bridge. What is the language and the space that needs to happen for that person to even trust it enough to step towards the bridge? And so that's kind of my work, is like being at that fulcrum point of like what's accessible, how to even create the access point for people from this paradigm to enter into this more expansive, expanded conscious, expanded heart, expanded spirit state. And there's for good. And I wanted to say this too. This is it's related, but I think it was important to swing the pendulum to the clinical side, that kind of like what you're saying, that kind of sterile clinical place, because there was so much harm done in the name of mysticism through certain organized religions, of just trust us, just trust this narrative, like people's autonomy and agency really being stripped of them by, and all of these awful things being done in the name of spirituality, which was really like religion and politics intertwined in a nasty incestuous thing. But I think this was an important part in the arc of humanity to go to that kind of blank slate clinical approach, so there could be even the place to disengage from all of that other stuff, come back to this really nascent experience of like, well, what's it like to not be told anything? What's it like to not have anything projected into the space? What's it like to just experience myself? But then, right, that place, after a while, it's like oh, this isn't it either. We can't stay there. We still have to evolve and bring back in story. What is the new story that we want to collectively create? And then, that'll evolve and shift, and we have to be willing to let that exhale happen and release that. And then a new one comes back in. So, yeah.
When you were talking about the Delta, I just kind of had a feeling. And it's like a lot of stuff's happened there. And there are some places I've been to in my life, 3 in particular, where there was just energy there. And there are New Orleans, Jerusalem, and Mexico City.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of blood's been shed in all 3 of those 3 places. I think that's probably what related to what I was feeling. There's just a lot happening. When you go to the Western Wall, there's a lot of energy moving there. There's a lot in Mexico City. I'm wondering if you think that there are places like that you've been that just hold an energy, and what do you think that is that we're experiencing?
What do I think that is?
Well, first, are there places like that for you that you've been where you're just like, there's an energy here? It could be good, bad, whatever, but where you just like, this place holds a power.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, all the places you mentioned, I've never been to Jerusalem, but New Orleans, definitely. The Mississippi Delta, definitely. Egypt, many of the places I went to in Egypt, where I go in Guatemala, around Lake Atitlan, feels like that. Yeah, I think there's absolutely many places like that, for sure.
What do you think it is that gives them their power, that gives them that feeling?
Well, I think that there are also bigger questions about time and space and the way that energy is impacted and lingers. I think, one thing that we've kind of, the reductionist view of our current paradigm is thinking that what we see is it. Like that once your body gets out of this room, then your body's no longer in this room, without the recognition of the impact that your energetic body, your emotional body has on this space in here. And so, well, I'll say too, like Normandy Beach in France was another, or in Normandy, Utah Beach was another place I felt it. There's all these places where you can feel it. Some people might call it ghosts. Some people might call it just like the residual energy of what happens. But I think it's, there's also the collective unconsciousness that Jung talks about a lot, that many traditions talk about. And it's kind of like just the remembered, something in our DNA just remembers. And we carry that.
It's like inherited memory.
It's inherited memory.
But it's like not necessarily conscious.
Yeah.
Right? It's just like you can feel the memory of it without really knowing. Yeah.
And then if you think about just like the physical elements of this world that create, molecules that create water or air that we breathe, and they all have been in these different places. I mean, water like carries so much memory, and we're just kind of starting to scratch the surface on how water carries memory and how water can be an interface of communication for that. So, I think there are many different explanations for why that is, but I do think there are for lack of a better word, like portals that hold energy, or energy continues to happen to me. And you think about places in the world that there's continuous conflict spiraling, or places where temples are built on top of temples, on top of temples, on top of temples.
Mexico City is both.
Yeah.
Jerusalem.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's like, kind of, sometimes it's like a which came first, chicken or the egg thing. It's like, I don't know, but there's something has happened that has continued to build in that space. I'm like, I have no doubt that there's something there. Do I understand it with this human mind in a way that I can fully articulate right now? No, and I don't think I need to, because I feel it. Right. And this is the other thing that I really think, like, is like, just because we can't put it into words doesn't mean we have to find a way to put it into words. And that is an intersection of trust that I think we're also building too, is like, what's it like to touch the trust of that intangible knowing, that unarticulatable knowing, and I'll say this too, this is kind of going in another direction, like polarity work around, you can say masculine, feminine, you can say that, but it's kind of more of the polarity of like the inner and the outer, kind of the matter and preformed matter. It's like, or potential versus real, as we call it, like the potential for this cup existed before this physical form of this cup
before you moved it. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. And so with that, it's like, there's potential in the knowing that I think is carried sometimes by, you can archetype it, or mythos, archetype it as, kind of the oracle, like the underworld. It's like the potential for something to be before it has come into being, before it has come into matter. And so these places, I do think, hold some of that type of mystery. In Egypt, I felt that. Like I remember coming back from there after that pilgrimage I took last year, and I was like, how do I even write about this? And then the message was like, you don't. I was like, what do you mean? It's like, well, you can share some things, but what are you going to even say? Like, what are you going to even say? It becomes something embodied. So that to me, it was like, oh, I received something from being in those places, being in those temples, stepping into those portals. It changed me. It changed my energy, my understanding, my way of moving in the world. I don't need to tell it. It's like, I go be it. It's like it changes your resonance. It changes the song. I think we walk around in this world almost as like living songs, in the sense that we're vibrating at imperceptible ways to these ears, but these other ways of hearing, like I can hear your song, my body hears your song. It knows where there's harmony, where there's disharmony. I can feel it in me, or like if I'm paying attention, and we all have it, or I can feel like my own harmony, I can feel my own song. And letting that be, that's part of that somatic, coming back home to the body, letting ourselves fully feel into the frequencies that we hold as inhabitants of this pretty complex form. It's not anything to tell. It's not anything to write about. It's something to feel. You have people talk about these mystery schools, these schools of knowing that it's like, part of like, well, no one talks about it and it's a mystery. I'm like, well, part of it is because it can't be talked about. Like, it's just, there's no way to talk about it. It's to be felt and experienced and trusted. And that's kind of been my experience with that. Like, there's things that I just can't even talk about because their words couldn't even begin to touch. And I would reduce it. It would reduce it to something that it isn't if I tried to put it into words.
I know the feeling you're describing. It's almost like it would be perverse to try. Mm-hmm. Something where it's like that. It's almost like it would be sacrilegious.
Some things are meant to remain ineffable.
Right. Mm-hmm. That's what I've said. You mentioned the masculine and feminine. I've become endlessly fascinated by those ideas in mythic terms, and why so many different cultures have different ideas of what that is and how similar they often are. But for me, I often think of the feminine as just pure mystery. And I joke because I say maybe that's because I'm a straight man, and like women are just an eternal mystery to me in a way that's very wonderful. But there are some things that I think I'm happier not understanding. One of my favorite trilogies in cinema is the Pirates of the Caribbean trilogy. I love it. It's pure adventure. I love it. It's the best score ever. And in the trilogy, in the second film, there's this Kraken, is this sea monster which was seen to be mythical, and this squid man pirate Davy Jones controlled the underworld. He would take people down to the depths, and he controlled this Kraken. And in the very beginning of the third movie, the Kraken his dead carcass is laying on a beach. It's been killed, and these pirates who had been running from this sea beast the whole second movie, they were terrified of it, were mourning for the death of this creature. And one of the reasons I love these movies is just the dialogue is just blissfully good to me. And the first mate says to the captain, Jack Sparrow, after the Kraken has died, he said, the world is a little bit smaller. And Jack says, no, the world stays the same. There's just less in it. And that to me is what like the idea of mystery represents, where it's almost like the magic of Christmas is another term I use in a very clunky way to try to describe a feeling in my body that I get sometimes, where it's like endless possibility because an unopened present represents an endless supply of possibilities. I mean, if it's this size, it's probably not a horse, but I mean,
Sure.
One would think, but when you're 4, maybe it is,
Right.
why anything could happen.
Yeah.
It's like endless possibility. And when you try to reduce something down to language, it kind of spoils that. And it's something I'm only learning recently because putting things into words is kind of my thing. I mean, I'm trying to make a living out of it.
Yeah.
But there are times when I've learned, especially with spiritual practice, where I'm like, man, I really wish I could stop thinking in words.
Yeah.
And ecstatic dance is one of the few times when, like, after I left this last Sunday, I was like, oh, it's one of those moments I'm not thinking in words right now. And it was like, it just feels good. What were you about to say?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's just that, most of my work right now, like in my practice, is with couples or people doing relational work. And I absolutely love it. It's my favorite thing to do, just like working with couples. It's probably some of my best work right now. And when I say that, it's just because like I can, like the interface between, I'm like, oh, I see what you're trying to do. And I know how to help you orchestrate to this place of heart connection if you're willing. But it reminds me of like, so much of talk therapy. It's like there's a lot of talking. So many couples, they just talk too much. They're talking through their stuff too much.
I relate to that.
And, there's a like.
Oh, they're like talking through their like a therapy.
They're talking through their cycles, and they're like, we just can't get through this cycle. I'm like, well, you're, and I say that a little tongue in cheek. Like talking is important, but it's like at a certain point, you're like, what you're doing is you have characters that are talking. There are 2 different characters in your being, usually like a wounded part. Like an unconscious wound, and there's like 2 wounded parts that are like looping back and forth, trying to get the other person's part to become the character that they needed at a certain time. And so I share all this because it relates to this talking and like this polarity concept, where it's like, one of the things that I teach, guide people, like couples in, it's like coming to this place of presence, and it's a place of non-talking. And it's something I've started really practicing in my own world too, of just like, what is it like to just look at this other person's eyes, go through like for a minute or 2 minutes, 3 minutes, and not even share what's going on internally. Just feel your own experience of what is happening internally in their presence, them holding presence for you, you holding presence for them. No words. Become aware of the inner experience. What's that like? Where do you want to run from that experience? Is it uncomfortable? Is it pleasant? Is it pleasurable? And so that becomes the place where it's like people learn how to expand the capacity for their own experience and compassion for their own experience without then immediately projecting it on the other person to fix or solve or do something about. Now, that's just a tool. There are definitely times when talking is helpful and appropriate, because there's plenty of people who have learned to stay silent and not express their needs, where then actually speaking up and expressing and witnessing how that other person responds and holds and is able to hold, or like them learning how to respond and hold presence for the request without going into like fix it or people pleasing mode or avoidance criticism mode. There are definitely times when speaking is helpful, but it is all from this place of like presence in the heart, and compassion for just the messy human that shows up. So just like, the kind of like that ineffable experience, like sometimes presence is meant to be ineffable, meaning undescribable. You don't have to describe what it is, that experience that actually so with the couples I work with, those moments where they're not talking, those actually become really foundational pillars of trust that actually open up the relational field for them to come in and do the deeper work, for them to talk about their vulnerabilities, their fears. And it's a bit, counterintuitive, or, people think it's like, well, it's a kind of a paradox that we didn't talk about it. We actually didn't talk about it. We just stayed in that presence. Mm-hmm.
Sometimes not talking about things is a brilliant way to resolve conflict. And I know you're right, it is a paradox. This is why all of like happiness and mental health are paradoxes or contradictions or good ideas that are in conflict with one another. Like, because you don't want to bury things, but you also like, in Northern Ireland, basically the way that they figured out how to stop killing each other was they just quit talking about whether they were British or Irish. They just simply stopped talking about it and started focusing on how do we fix the potholes left from all the car bombs.
Yeah, there's that attention thing again. Where's our attention?
Right? Like it's just, and one of the things I learned from therapy of talking a lot, which like I'm good at, you get really good at talking about your problems.
Exactly.
Yeah, right. But after a certain point, that doesn't lead anywhere. After it kind of becomes a cul-de-sac, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the thing about cul-de-sacs is they're worse than a dead end, because when you get to a dead end, you at least turn around and go back the other way. But like in a cul-de-sac, that's why I've said about psychiatric diagnosis that they explain nothing and they lead nowhere. So you never learn if you're wrong or not, and you just circle. But yeah, I can imagine with couples acceptance. I think a lot about wedding speeches that I've heard from people that are older and have been married, and they give advice to the bride and groom about this is my advice on a good marriage. I think a lot of it amounts to how do you live with another human being for 20, 30, 50 years? You have to accept some stuff's not going to change and just agree not to argue about it. We can just set that aside. But of course, finding the discernment to know when do we just not talk about it, or when is not talking about it burying it? Right. And that's when having a third person, like having a clinician, or it's someone that is there that can be a third party observer. That's really where it comes down, because you should always. There are times when you should talk more. There are times when you should talk less. And how do you know? Well, I don't know.
Yeah. And some of it's an experience, but some of it is also exactly what we've been talking about, like coming back to the body, to the somatic, emotional, spiritual experience. And I start with the body because that's something like, spirituality can be, there's plenty of discourse around that, of people deciding whether that's an optional thing or not. I don't think it is. I think it is a natural expression of the human psyche to go there. But anyways, side note. But I think the body and the somatic work, and I think that's why it's so important here, because that's where learning the feeling of pleasure versus displeasure, learning the what does a yes feel like in your body, what does a no feel like in your body, what does restriction feel like in your body, what does restraint feel like in your body. They're different things, and it's subtle. And we can't feel subtleness if we're half numbed out, or if we have a bunch of calluses built up. We have to let the calluses soften. We have to uncinch the nerves so that we can come back to the subtle sensitivity of the body, so that we can know, if, for example, with a couple that if I'm working with them, like part of their work is somatic presence, mindful awareness, attention to their own system. It's like, and so I'll be watching them like, oh, your eyes looked away and up out of your head. Like, what was going on? Check in with yourself. What is your body feeling when you think about not expressing your feelings when they're in the middle of crying? And they're like, well, I feel, it can be like, well, I feel like I'm, suppressing my needs. I'm like, okay, was that a story is that a now story, or is that an old story where you did have to be the caretaker for a dysregulated parent by stuffing your needs down? And is this different? Is this a moment when you can actually be like, well, okay, my partner needs to cry right now, but they also are someone that can come back to this conversation later, and I can express my needs later. And so like telling the difference between the somatic story that's coming alive in the body, but like without that conscious awareness to that, it's just going to be like, oh, I'm suppressing my needs. I need to insert myself right now. It doesn't matter. They got to make room for me. Oh, they got to make room for me. And it becomes an entangled dynamic. But having that awareness and then coming down into it, also knowing like the difference between a yes and a no, and a pleasure and displeasure. That is where you get to write the story of your coupleship, your dynamic, from a somatic mythos rather than an inherited mythos.
How much of what you're doing with couples now, how much of that involves dealing with therapy speak that's just extant, like on TikTok or wherever, like the people are bringing in? Do you find that kind of like people normalizing talking in those terms is helpful or not helpful or neutral or both?
A little bit of both.
Yeah.
I think it's great that more people are having this conversation and discourse. And then it's like, of course, people come in and they've watched, a TikTok with, 10 bullet points on what a green flag is or a red flag is. And it's like, it's a little more nuance to it. But I do think it is helpful. Like, I think it is good that people are talking about it more, but everything that trends has like a side that's helpful and positive and a side that is harmful and creates more friction. It's like, okay, well, let's just, again, it's about where am I going to place the attention? Where am I going to help? And so that's a big thing too, is like helping people find that point of attention. And that's something that a lot of, Eastern, like if you look at Buddhism and a lot of these practices, or Buddhism to like, sweat lodge, there's all these ways about like, it's about coming into the depth of attention, because when we deepen our inner witness, we're able to witness our experience from deeper and deeper and deeper layers, to where we're not over-identifying with our emotions, we're not over-identifying with our stories, with our history, with our past, with our culture, our families, and we're identifying from this like deep seat of an inner compassionate witness that says, wow, okay, my body is feeling this right now. I am in a body that's experiencing this. I'm in a relationship that's experiencing this, and we can take a TikTok list of 10 green flags and red flags, and then you can see like, well, what is it like for me to witness my reaction to those things?
And isn't that interesting?
Yeah, rather than be like, this is it. It's like, well, how do I?
Yeah.
What do I notice?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So it's funny, you just made a transition there from, we were talking about couples and marriage and started mentioning spiritual traditions. You also just have recently become Reverend Lauren Russell, right? And I'm just wondering if you could tell us about that. Yeah. How does that fit into the story of you?
It's so funny because that wasn't, for one, it's very easy to get that designation.
Correct. Like welcome to America.
Yeah. Like it's like you get on, this is like through the church, the Universalist Church of the USA. You fill out some forms, you pay $30. It takes 30 minutes. Mm-hmm. So
congratulations.
Yeah. There's not like, I just want to name that.
Sure.
There's nothing.
Right.
I didn't go to seminary. Mm-hmm. But what it did do, so the reason why I did that is because I was working with a couple that wanted me to officiate their wedding. And I've done like hand binding ceremonies, and I've done like these different kind of reverential, ceremonies for people coming together before. But this was like a first time like officiate a wedding. And so I was like, oh, let me go get my officiant's thing. And so I looked at different options, and I was like, oh, great, that's an option. But it was so funny because I've wanted to do that for years. I love. And, it's one of my favorite rituals about like humans is like the way that we ritualize love. Now, have we created quite an arc, an industry out of that? Yeah. That's a whole different topic. But I love ritual, whether it's birth rituals, birthdays, ceremonies with weddings, ceremonies for life transitions. I think we need more of those, and we need more honorable, beautiful representations. And I love, when two beautiful souls come together and they want to proclaim their love and share it in that way. It's amazing. So I had this couple I did premarital work with, and they were so delightful. And so I got the Reverend officiant, and they sent all their swag and stuff and all the certificates. And I looked at it and I saw Reverend Lauren Russell, and I was like, that actually makes a lot of sense. It just like clicked, like something was like,
that's what we're putting on the title of this video for sure. I mean, okay. I knew weeks ago that's what we were doing, so I wanted to ask about it. But it does make sense.
It makes just fits. Something about that makes sense, and I don't know why or how, but like something was like, oh. Okay. Mm-hmm. I don't need to ascribe meaning to it, but I'm just going to keep exploring that and letting that unfold. Because it is kind of like, it turns it on its cheek, because most of the time people see that title and they automatically assume a Christian church. Right. I'm not affiliated with any religion. In fact, one of the things I hope to do is to officiate weddings for people that churches wouldn't officiate for. I'm like, yes, bring me, let me honor that bond that you have. And also, I really love the idea of reclaiming words. Speaking of words, like, reverend, spirituality. Let's
Marriage.
reclaim those. Marriage, right. Can we reclaim those back? And that goes back to what we were saying, like the essence of a myth rather than the literalness of a myth. Can we fracture? Can we let what it's become to mean fracture and fall and compost? And can we reclaim the essence of what that means? Like, what is a reverend? That is someone who can like hold the container with reverence. Think about it, reverence. It is like, this is a moment to be held with reverence. And that is what I'm here to do, is to honor what's happening in front of me, like by listening to how you want this moment to be honored, and to create that experience for you and to hold that for you. And then, of course, bonus, I get to officially sign the paperwork that lets the government decide that you're fine to do what you want to do. Same with LPC at the end of my name, licensed professional counselor. So valuable, and like such a valuable degree. I'm grateful for it. And also, like, it's just like the string of letters that help people know, like, oh, right, that's a person that has done XYZ, but it doesn't fully capture everything. Like, I'm not doing LPC work the same way that someone down the road is doing LPC work.
Right.
So reclaiming words, reclaiming marriage, that word, oh my God.
I would love to talk about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I mean, as you were saying it, I've begun to feel lately like I'm wondering if marriage, the idea of it is just outdated. How much of it is just inherently patriarchal, which is not necessarily good or bad for me, but I've begun to realize more like, if you don't really, once it became important to know who to inherit land to, like it becomes important to know who's the biological parent of someone. And doing that along the patrilineal line is kind of stupid, because technically it's really hard to tell who the father of a child is, whereas it's very easy to tell who the mother of a child is. But that, it's no longer really something that's important now, to me, seems, when women have become economically liberated. What role do you think marriage plays now? I mean, if with women have the freedom that they have, I think a lot of women feel like they don't need it. And I think there's a lot of evidence that men are much more in need of marriage, much more in need of wives than women are of husbands. And that's assuming a heteronormative context. But I mean, just how do you feel about this term and this institution now where we are in history?
I mean, it's a big topic, because you're right. Like, a lot of the way we've understood the contract and the institution of marriage has been through land. It's about like land ownership and like property stewardship and person's like ownership. And we can be done with that. We can, let's let that go. And it's also not just that. It is like the ritual of union of two people coming together in a statement of love and commitment, and defining it how they want to define it. And then there's something really powerful about proclaiming something to those who are close to you. We talk about the power of word, the power of sound, and like that's a whole topic too, like how music and sound are so like they bring in something into the tangible world. This conversation here is now tangibly exists in this world, not just because it's being recorded, but because we've had it. And before then, it was just neurons firing. It was just ideas in the ether. And then it's like we turned it into thoughts, and those thoughts then turned our vocal cords into making vibration. The breath came through our bodies, and the words come out, and the words are out there vibrating, hitting the table, the cup, the microphone, everything. And now they are part of this tangible existence. And so when we make those proclamations and statements, I think it impacts reality. I was at a, this is related, but I was with a circle of friends last night watching music, and there was a couple there who was hosting, and they're in their 50s, I believe, and I don't know how long they've been married, but I was sitting next to the woman, and her husband came up behind her while the music was playing, and I heard him whisper to her, "I missed you so much, my love." And she'd been out of town the week before, and like then feeling that, hearing him say that statement of love and hearing the clarity of that impacted me, and I was just like, wow, that was beautiful. And so like the ripple effect of making those proclamations from the heart. I think is what the world needs. We need that kind of ripple of love, the vibration of love, but the true form. I mean, marriage as it stands now, of course, there are plenty of people that love each other, but the institution of the wedding and the marriage, like, whoo,
it means something. I mean, the ritual, it's something you do to imbue a certain meaning. And it seems like, I think a lot about also just how to define this term ritual and how to explain it to people. I'm a member of a fraternity, a college fraternity. Well, I'm no longer in college. I'm an alumnus now, but fraternities have rituals and as do sororities. And I recently had a conversation with some friends. I was on an alumni podcast and we talked about what it means. And, rituals seem to mark, it seems ubiquitous that they'll mark 3 events in life: birth, marriage, and death. And those are the 3 that we seem to pay the most attention to. Do you also see yourself having any role with the other 2 rituals, birth or death, as in your capacity as a reverend?
Yes, absolutely. I that's birth, death, and union. Those are the things
Union.
that
I like that.
Yeah.
I think I like that better than marriage. It kind of gets more to the point of what's happening.
Right.
Right.
And that could even refer to, I've thought about this of someone going through a separation or a divorce, they are coming into reunion with themselves. And honoring the breaking of one union and back into reunion with themselves, and to be held by community in that way. Because as someone who went through divorce, right, it was oh, this is weird. How am I held by my community in this way? And that is also something that's pretty new. Women getting to choose to do that if something is harming them. Oh my gosh, our grandmothers weren't even able to do that with the freedom that we can now. It's huge. So I want to create a ritual around that as well. But yeah, the birth and death, I think death is something, both of those portals, I think it's 2 sides of the same portal. But those are 2 things there's definitely a resurgence in death doula work. We've had midwife work and
what is death doula? What is doula work?
Doula work is the someone who's assisting the crossover, assisting the transition. Midwife, they're with midwifing, it's kind of the person quite literally there, and the doula usually helps with the before and the after. Okay. They don't necessarily need the medical knowledge, but they're there. It's kind of they're there.
Facilitate a spiritual transition.
Yeah. And so that's definitely the conversation around death work has come back in a big way, because gosh, we have poorly, all of these things, death, birth, union, we have really skewed the potency of what they can represent and how we can honor that moment. So yeah, I would love to do that. I think right now, part of my, there's so many different things that I can do, want to do, have done. Right now I'm in this stage of life, I'm feeling this real deep call to sovereignty, which is kind of coming back into sovereignty with my own energy. The last 5-10 years, I've had a lot of output and growth, and I'm feeling the need, the call to bring my life back into a place of sovereignty, and focus on really anchoring in a lot of this wisdom into my lived experience. So for me, my focus more is on probably union rites, and eventually it could shift into expanding more into birth and death. But right now I'm really enjoying working at the interface of love and union, working with couples, working with even discernment, couples choosing to separate. Same with the unions of marriage, or offering rituals around marriage, rituals around separation. But I really feel that is where my work is focused right now. And then eventually that'll probably shift, because it keeps doing so. And as the parent of a teenager, that's a lot of work right now. And I'm just really focused on anchoring in my world and creating a sense of sovereignty for her as well.
So I think I have one last question. This narrative of language has come up, a narrative, this whole conversation. And there was a question I wanted to ask you earlier, and I didn't, because there was a word I didn't feel right about. And I was thinking about when you were talking about your work with people that were unhoused, and also just the time that we've been talking about you working with people with trauma, that in that you have experienced things where people you have heard stories or probably personally witnessed moments of evil. And one of the questions I wanted to ask was, do you take that on what kind of work do you do to take care of yourself as a clinician? But I stopped because I wasn't sure about the word evil. And I think I'd rather ask you, do you believe that there is such a thing as evil, and is it ever okay to call a person evil?
That is a yes and question, for sure. I think the word evil is a word that we've developed as humans to describe a quality of vibration or energy that causes a lot of harm. We could call it anything. We could call it gobbledygook. We could call it, it could be, but it's like, and this is kind of one of the ways that words do help. Because I think it is all energy. I think what we call evil is this, like, it's a density that is so dense it almost becomes like, almost like the energy of a black hole, where it the more it feeds on it feeds on itself, and if it can inspire more density in others, then it just feeds on that. Like if evil then inspires a ton of rage and reactivity, then it feeds on that rage and reactivity. So it is, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be angry and we need to love and light everything. No, get pissed off about things that no, this isn't about that. But it's being aware of how much are you fueling your own rage, because that's only going to poison your own system to continue to stay in an enraged state. It's be pissed off about injustice. Absolutely. Let Kali, Sekhmet energy, and those are other archetypes from different belief systems. Let the anger and the righteousness of that fuel a path of love. But just don't let it sit in your system, because that's when it gets toxic to our systems. Do I think it's okay to call people evil? Or
do you think that people can ever be evil?
I think they can. I think people can absolutely embody evil energy. Absolutely. I can sometimes, get in the nuanced phrasing of that, of absolutely. I think people can be so overtaken by that darkness and density that their hearts get lost in there. And there were some other things that, you talked about soul fragmentation and freezing that I, also wanted to talk about too briefly, that's related to this, and soul reconnection is a phrase used in some traditions about exactly that, that when things happen, traumatic things happen, it can fragment the soul and parts of the soul leave the body. So there are practices to bring back the soul to the body, whether that be through, things like temescal or plant baths or drumming, or there's so many different types of ways to do that. And I think we've lost touch with a lot of those practices, and people I think that evilness, whatever we want to call it, has been it's a consistent fragmentation where, it might be there are people that are so fragmented that it's kind of in the way that disease can overtake a body, if there's not enough health, it's it doesn't mean that, someone, if, this is a tricky thing to talk about too. It's one of those slightly ineffable things, but if you don't take care of your body, if your body has a weakness in the immune system, disease can take over. Does that mean that person at their heart and soul is their soul evil? No. But their body, got, a disease, and they, it may overtake them. In the same way that this whatever we're calling evil energy, it's if it gets in there, if there's fractures in the heart or soul, this energy can kind of come in and sometimes can take over a person like a cancer. And their soul may, this is kind of esoteric thought, but their soul may actually not even be a part of their body anymore. And it's because it's so fragmented, and it's we've kind of, we're not participating in this life anymore. So
do you think in that, in cases like that, do you think those people are beyond helping? Do you think there are people that
I don't think
that
I
are so
have any
fragmented?
place to say.
Yeah.
I don't think I can speak with authority to that.
Yeah.
You know, because there have been times in history where that's been believed, that there were people that were lost causes, and it's not turned out to be true. That doesn't feel like something I have the authority to speak upon.
Yeah. My instinct is no. Like, well, I mean, because of so much of what we talked about today is that the past gets kind of brought present, right, and frozen in time. You can look at people, I think most people would say like serial killers, psychopaths, things like that, or like if they were going to make a case that there is such a thing as evil, would point to people like that. But basically, all of them were abused as children.
Yeah,
like it seems like it's almost essential to produce someone who's like a true psychopath. So,
and also there's I've worked with a lot of people who fall under those diagnoses. Some of those people I've worked with in prisons. Some of those people I worked with on the streets. High levels of abuse, and also sometimes there are aberrations in brain chemistry and brain structure.
Really?
There just are. And that combined with nature and nurture, and like sometimes it just happens, you know? And that's kind of where it's like, oh, yeah, that's a big question there. Because it's like, yeah, their brains may not even have the capacity to experience empathy in the way that you and I do. And they may, that's an interesting place to be, because I have encountered and cared for and offered services to people that are like that, and they have the awareness. Sometimes they have the awareness that they know, like, I know the things I'm doing are not acceptable, but I can't access the emotions and that would make me care to not do this.
Yeah.
And so it's like...
And you care for them anyway, or you did at that time?
I did. I cared in the sense that I believe in their dignity. I believe that they deserve to be treated with dignity, even if they have to experience life in an institutional setting. It's like, how can there still be dignity for their experience?
Right.
You know. Yeah.
Yeah. Are there any other things that we haven't gotten to yet?
Probably.
This can't be everything, right? Yeah. Should there be a round 2, you think?
If
Sometime?
you want to, yeah.
I think that's probably going to happen. I want to thank you for coming on. I've loved this conversation from the very opening minutes of it. And what I think I'll take away from it, these 2 themes of narrative and language, especially language. That one's personal to me because there's a part of me that's one of those old hallways I could go down that wants to say I talk too much. And that's a story, right? And I don't think that's necessarily the correct story or my story anymore. But my relationship to language has changed a lot in recent years, and I'm able to listen now, which is actually satisfying in a completely different way to talking. And I struggle somewhat. I've struggled a lot with one of the things about wanting to change it, because for a long time, the way I did communicate was pretty maladaptive. It was just disordered. But I think that part of it is just that's the way my brain works. Like there may be trauma elements to it, and it may be ADHD or something, but it might just be because I have a good capacity for language, and it's where like my intellect comes from. And so I was always kind of ambivalent about wanting to change it. This podcast is kind of, I think, a pro-social way of dealing with the problem, is that I can hopefully make a living from talking. If I'd known there was a way to do that in high school, I would have just done it. But Fox News immediately became a bad idea for me. So I wasn't going to lie about what I actually believed. So, but I will say again that being able to listen more than I speak is a really deeply satisfying thing in a way that I don't have a word for it. And one of the things that I've looked back a lot of my journey with therapy, because I've had probably about 10 years of it now. And like I said, it's become an important part of my life, the work that I have done. And I think one of the big changes for me was when I finally understood that it's not even necessarily that 2 opposite things can be right at the same time, like dialectical thinking. It's that some things are illogical but still true. And one, like an example would be, I realized at one point, like, it's actually really irrational to trust anybody. Like if you just think about it in purely mathematical terms, it makes no sense. Like you don't have anything to gain by it. Like, and yet life's just better when you do it. And then the question becomes, how do you pick? Like how do you develop the discernment and the skill to know who to trust and when and with what? And there's a lot more messiness there. But it's, again, it's not rational. I mean, even you could think about it in evolutionary terms, but like, not really.
There's still like margins of error no matter what.
Right. Like there's a chance that you could be taken advantage of. There's a free rider problem. You might be really hurt. And that's, I think that the bottom line with the kind of work that you do is what if I get hurt?
Yep.
And the thing is, you might. And wouldn't that be an interesting experience? That's how I would tend to think of that now. I mean, I don't want to, but like, all right, well, that'll be an experience. I'll have an experience of being hurt then, and I'm sure I'll learn something from it. So language has been, changing my language has been a big part of my development too. I used to be really, really negative. And that's another thing I've learned is that there are certain words I've learned to just kind of delete from my self-talk. Kind of the way that the Irish don't really talk about whether they're British or Irish. It's like, you could argue about it till the end of time and try to blow everybody up.
Yeah.
Or you could focus on like how wonderful life is and use words like wonderful and interesting and curious and things like that. So I think that's definitely what I'll take away from this conversation is to think more about language and that there might be a higher or more spiritual purpose to leaving certain things unsaid.
Yeah.
But I'm not going to do it here because nobody would watch that.
Right. Yeah.
For a minute, I wanted to see if we could just stare at each other for a couple minutes, like with your couples, and just see. But that would be the end of the episode.
That would be it.
Okay, we'll do it right now. All right.
Okay.
Are you ready? 3, 2, 1.